I'm Rowan Whitaker, 33. And 4 months ago, I opened a court envelope on my lunch break and realized my own parents had petitioned to strip me of every legal right I had. The clerk who handed it over mentioned that the judge expected my acknowledgement by the end of the week. And I walked to my car, repeating the words mentally unfit until they stopped sounding real. The petition rustled in my hands when I unfolded it across the steering wheel and saw my name framed as someone incapable of running her own life. A brief murmur of traffic outside faded when my eyes locked on the section listing fabricated behaviors, and I caught myself whispering that none of this had ever happened. The language felt cold in a way only paperwork can manage, especially when it paints you as a stranger to your own stability. I scanned the margins for anything familiar and froze when a slanted blue line appeared at the bottom. POA attached and still effective sat there in Marshall's handwriting, and the ink bled slightly at the curve of the P like it always did when he signed roofing contracts at the kitchen counter. The memory of revoking that document 3 years earlier hit with a clarity sharp enough to steady my breath, and I traced the corner of the page as if touching it would rewrite what I understood about their intent. Nothing in the stack felt accidental anymore, and that one handwritten note rearranged everything I thought this petition was supposed to be. I carried the papers into my apartment after work, letting the quiet settle while the overhead light flickered once before, holding steady. My phone buzzed with Lorraine's voice floating through the speaker, urging me to take better care of myself and reminding me that stress could cloud judgment. But the careful softness in her tone only emphasized how prepared she was for me to believe their story. I let her words drift into the air without arguing because the call revealed more in its calmness than any raised voice could have. A second buzz followed with Marshall's message telling me to sign the voluntary transfer before complications arose, and the certainty threaded through his words matched the handwriting on the petition. I stood beside my small table where probate files usually lived and listened to him insist that compliance would protect everyone involved, as though my autonomy were a formality he'd already scheduled to remove. When the voicemail ended, the room felt narrower, and the note in blue ink pressed against my thoughts with the weight of something that had been planned long before I opened that envelope. I placed the petition flat on the counter where the evening light skimmed across its surface, and the handwriting glinted faintly against the printed text. The loops and angles belonged unmistakably to him, matching the old insurance forms stored in a box in my closet. And seeing that familiar script claiming authority over me tightened something behind my ribs. By the time the refrigerator hummed back to life, I understood that whatever came next would start with that blue line at the bottom of the page and the quiet confidence of someone who thought I would never challenge it. I picked up Lorraine's call the next morning while walking from the courthouse lot, and her voice floated through the speaker with a soft reminder that everyone was worried and a suggestion that I must have pushed myself too hard again. Yet the pause before she breathed my name revealed she already believed the version of me written in the petition. I let her talk about rest and support, while the sound of my shoes against the pavement marked each stretch of silence she tried to fill. And the final line urging me to cooperate only confirmed how synchronized she and Marshall had become. When the call ended, the weight settling behind my ribs felt heavier than the paperwork in my bag. A voicemail from Marshall followed before I reached my office door, pressing through with the same offhand authority he used during childhood dinners and insisting that signing a voluntary conservatorship would avoid unnecessary messes. He emphasized family reputation in a tone that carried no room for disagreement, and he closed the message by urging me to act like an adult who understood obligations. I stood by the elevator bank until the recording clicked off and knew the pressure campaign had just begun. By lunchtime, my supervisor stopped at my desk to mention that someone had called inquiring about my stability, and the careful neutrality in her expression told me the rumor machine had already moved beyond family. She added that she had no concerns about my performance. Yet the fact that the question arrived so quickly had a precision that matched the blue ink note on the petition. I nodded once, then returned to the probate files stacked beside my keyboard, and let the rhythm of reviewing them settle my pulse. When I got home that evening, I pulled the storage box from beneath my bed and opened the binder containing 11 years of contributions, dividends, and rental income summaries. and the quiet certainty of those pages grounded me more than any conversation had. Susan Carver came by after her shift ended, glancing over the figures and remarking that Marshall had no idea what I'd built, and the faint lift of her eyebrows traced how stark the truth looked when organized in a single place. We sat at my small table assembling the initial disclosure packet, and the soft click of each sheet protector closing felt like the beginning of the real fight. Before she left, Susan mentioned that if the court wanted a full financial inventory, then presenting accuracy was the only advantage I needed, and the steadiness in her voice aligned with the pages spread across the table. I walked her to the door with the binder tucked under my arm, replaying the messages from earlier and noting how every line pushed me towards silence rather than confrontation. When the apartment fell quiet again, I placed the binder beside the petition and understood that pressure only works on someone who has something to lose. And all they could take from me now was time. I met Amelia Reddington the following afternoon in her narrow office off Colfax. And before I even sat down, she gestured toward the petition, spread across her desk, and remarked that whoever drafted it had built their case on assumptions instead of facts. Then asked how much of it I recognized as real. I told her every claim was fiction except the part where my parents wanted control, and she tapped a finger against the margin, as she noted that petitions like this rarely appear without a financial motive, buried somewhere behind the signatures. When she suggested pulling my full credit reports before sunset, the click in her voice carried a certainty that pushed me to breathe once and agree. I spent that evening at my kitchen table with the laptop angled under the overhead light, scrolling through familiar accounts until 2 unfamiliar credit cards appeared with balances I never authorized, and a signature on each file that tried too hard to look like mine. My hand hovered over the trackpad as I opened the next entry, showing a HELOC drawn against one of my Colorado rentals. And the rush of heat up my spine sharpened when I whispered that the signature on that loan was not mine and had never touched my pen. The apartment felt unbearably still as I read the approval date and understood that the revoked POA had been revived behind my back to justify a debt I never requested. When I returned to Amelia the next morning, she examined the printouts with a steady focus and remarked that this pattern fit identity misuse more than poor bookkeeping, adding that timing the discovery to the conservatorship petition created a trail too neat to be accidental. She lifted the HELOC page between us and observed that lenders rarely catch forged signatures unless someone forces the issue in court. Then noted that Marshall's access to the old POA gave him everything he needed to impersonate me on paper. She closed the folder with a quiet assurance that we would not confront any of this early, because letting their case collapse under its own structure would do more damage than an argument could. Before I left, Amelia contacted a forensic accounting firm and requested an expedited audit, explaining that the documentation had to carry the authority of certified findings to withstand scrutiny in a contested hearing. She summarized the plan in measured phrases, noting that the disclosure I'd prepared with Susan Carver would fold into the audit to expose inconsistencies between what my parents accused me of and what the financial records proved. I walked out with the binder pressed against my ribs, replaying each forged line and realizing that every detail they created to paint me as incapable had unlocked the exact mechanism I needed to reveal what they'd taken. I met Owen Mallory 2 days after Amelia initiated the audit, and he introduced himself by observing that the forged HELOC signature leaned too heavily on the curve of the R, then asked whether Marshall had. I told him the only signatures he'd ever handled were old roofing contracts stained with grease, and Owen nodded toward the printouts as he remarked that whoever forged these documents knew exactly which lenders performed minimal verification. He opened his laptop and noted that his first step would involve retrieving every communication tied to the disputed accounts, including phone logs the lenders kept even when they claimed otherwise. He moved through each file with a calm focus and remarked that the timestamp patterns suggested someone had called the lenders during weekday mornings, then asked whether Marshall worked from home often enough to make those windows convenient. I watched him flag inconsistencies that I hadn't noticed and admitted that the timing aligned too neatly with the petition's preparation. And he leaned back slightly as he mentioned that coordinated timing usually meant someone felt confident about not being caught. When he requested access to my phone records for cross-checking, I handed over my latest statement without hesitating. That evening, Owen forwarded a secured folder to me containing lender call logs attached to one credit card application. And he pointed out that the number used for verification wasn't mine, despite being listed under my name. I stared at the digits while whispering that the number belonged to Marshall's office landline in Englewood, and the realization tightened my breath in a way the forged signatures hadn't. The folder also included a clipped note showing that the lender approved the account within 5 minutes of that call, suggesting the person who impersonated me knew the process well enough to move quickly. When I returned to Amelia's office the next morning, Owen joined us by video and explained that 2 more disputed accounts had identical verification patterns, then added that this repetition would strengthen our motion to invalidate the petition. Amelia reviewed the log sheets and remarked that the audit firm would anchor these findings to the financial discrepancies we'd already uncovered, which meant the court would have to address the misconduct before considering any argument regarding my capacity. I felt something steady lift inside me as she arranged the pages into a sequence that mapped every step they took to build their case against me. Before we ended the meeting, Owen mentioned he had begun pulling recordings from lenders that automatically captured verification calls, and he added that at least one bank stored voice files for up to 18 months. He adjusted his headset and observed that if the recordings matched the Englewood number, then the conservatorship petition would collapse under evidence rather than accusation, which was precisely the outcome Amelia had planned for. I walked out with the binder under my arm and the secured folder on my phone, knowing the next phase would hinge on the voices captured during those calls and the fact that none of them belonged to me. The morning I walked into Santa Fe County Court, the clerk directed me to the counsel table while noting that the petitioners had already arrived. And I caught a brief glimpse of Marshall adjusting his tie as Lorraine whispered that everything would go smoothly once the judge understood my condition. Amelia leaned toward me with a quiet murmur that today's record would matter more than their confidence, and she added that the court's patience for fabricated evidence was thin in New Mexico. I set my binder down as the judge entered and called the case, feeling the weight of the blue ink note in my mind as firmly as if it were printed across the table. Marshall opened with the assertion that their petition was necessary because I had become erratic and financially vulnerable, and he added that they feared I might lose control of my properties if someone didn't intervene. But the tremor in his breath betrayed how rehearsed the words felt. Lorraine followed with a soft insistence that they only wanted to keep me safe and that too much independence had clearly overwhelmed me, then angled her voice toward the judge as though presenting kindness itself as evidence. I looked at the petition resting before me and felt the steadiness of knowing every line they referenced had already been dismantled by the audit. When the judge invited our response, Amelia rose and began by stating that the petition relied on events that never occurred, then asked permission to submit the forensic audit that contradicted each financial allegation. She explained that the audit traced multiple accounts, loans, and credit lines to signatures that tested inconsistent with mine, and she added that the lender verifications connected to a telephone number registered to Marshall's Englewood office. The judge lifted a brow at the mention of the matched call logs, and his attention sharpened as Amelia continued. Owen joined by video, greeting the court before outlining the verification patterns that appeared across the disputed accounts, and he clarified that the lenders had provided recordings that captured every approval call. He noted that the voice on the files did not match mine, and he highlighted the timestamps that aligned with the preparation of the petition, while my own phone records showed no outgoing calls to those lenders. He paused before concluding that the pattern indicated impersonation using an outdated power of attorney. The judge signaled for the recordings to be played, and the first clip filled the room with a voice confidently confirming my date of birth, speaking over faint office noise that I recognized from childhood visits to Marshall's Englewood workspace. A second recording followed with another verification, and I heard the same voice urging the lender to expedite approval, then providing a callback number that belonged to his landline. When the judge asked whether I recognized the voice, I answered with only one word, yes. Amelia submitted the revocation document for the old POA, noting that it had been properly executed and recorded years earlier. And she added that using it after revocation constituted misrepresentation in a financial context. She placed the HELOC paperwork beside the revocation and pointed out the signature discrepancies that matched the forensic findings. Then explained that the loan proceeds had been transferred into an account outside my control. The judge turned toward Marshall and asked whether he could explain why a revoked POA had been used to authorize a loan against my property. Marshall lifted his chin with a wavering insistence that he had acted only to protect family assets, and he added that I lacked the judgment to maintain them without guidance. Lorraine reached for his arm while murmuring that the petition had been filed out of love. But her voice thinned when the judge asked why fabricated behavioral episodes had been included in the petition. Their silence stretched long enough for the clerk's pen to tap once against the desk. Amelia closed our presentation by stating that the petitioners had attempted to seize control of my estate through falsified financial distress, forged authorizations, and mischaracterized personal claims. And she emphasized that the evidence established not incapacity, but exploitation. She added that the court's role was to protect vulnerable individuals from undue influence, not deliver them into it, and she requested immediate dismissal with findings of misconduct. I watched the judge study the binder, the call logs, and the signatures, and I felt the room shift as he prepared to speak. When he announced that the petition was dismissed with prejudice and that further investigation into the misuse of financial instruments would proceed, the sound of the gavel seemed to land directly at the center of the table between us. Marshall drew a breath as if preparing to argue, but the judge reminded him that the record was closed and that additional statements would not alter the ruling. I gathered my binder with a calmness that settled across my shoulders like something earned, not granted, and walked out of the courtroom knowing the next steps would be mine alone to decide. The week after the hearing, I returned to my apartment with the binder tucked beneath my arm, and Susan stopped by that evening to remark that the ruling had traveled through town faster than anything she'd seen, then asked how it felt to finally have the record reflect the truth. I told her the silence in my chest felt different now, steadier than the fear that used to live there, and she nodded once while noting that surviving something like this reshapes the ground you stand on. When she left, the quiet settled around me in a way that felt earned rather than forced. Marshall called 2 days later, offering a strained request to meet privately so we could clear the air, and the pause before his next breath revealed he still hoped the dismissal hadn't closed every door. I told him there was nothing to discuss because the court had already spoken, and the faint scrape of static on the line carried the weight of someone realizing their leverage no longer mattered. When the call ended, the stillness in my apartment felt sharper but lighter, as if the space finally belonged fully to me. Lorraine sent an email that afternoon asking whether I might reconsider a mediated conversation for the sake of family harmony, and her careful tone tried to frame the entire ordeal as misunderstanding rather than strategy. I read the message once before, replying that harmony requires truth, then attached a single scanned page of the forged HELOC signature that matched the recordings they never expected anyone to find. When her response never arrived, I closed my laptop with the quiet understanding that some distances protect more than they cost. I met Amelia later that week to finalize the paperwork, closing the matter, and she remarked that resilience looks different when someone has tried to rewrite your life on paper, then slid the certified dismissal across the table as if placing a final boundary between their story and mine. I carried the document through the parking lot with the New Mexico sun warming the edges, hearing Amelia's earlier observation echo softly that freedom sometimes begins with the moment a court record puts your name back where it belongs. By the time I reached my car, the binder felt less like a shield and more like proof of what I refused to surrender. Thank you for staying with me through this story. Sharing it reminded me how strength can take root in the quietest moments. And I hope wherever you are listening from, you feel the same clarity, warmth, and steadiness I'm finally beginning to recognize in my own life.